Welcome to this episode of ComSpeak. It is indeed our most special episode. Special because I think we have the senior most figure in the Indian public relations space, somebody I refer to as the father of modern Indian public relations consulting, as our guest. We are lucky that he chose to be in the world of media and PR. If he had his way, he would have been a fighter pilot and been a part of maybe the Indian Air Force, but maybe sometime in the course of the interview, we will know why that didn't happen. We have with us none other than Mr. Roger C.B. Pereira. Roger is based in Mumbai, and we are doing this remotely using technology today. Thank you so much, Roger, for making the time to join us and share with us insights and ideas about your journey in the world of PR over the last 50, 60 years.
Thank you so much, Amith. That's very kind of you. You've been very kind and gracious in your introduction. I only hope I deserve it at the end of the interview.
I'm looking forward to this, and I'm sure there's lots of things that one will learn from hearing your responses to the questions I have. We'll go straight back 50 plus years into your early years. Take us back to 1957, the year when you were maybe a college-going student and you began working on the side. Tell us about how it all started in the world of work in the professional world for you back in 1957.
Sure. It was a pure accident. I was doing my inter-arts or second year in college, as we used to call it in those years. And there was a college mate of mine called Pratap Sharma. He grew up in East Africa, and he and I were good buddies. We used to act in plays together. He did the writing, I did the acting, and sometimes we both did the acting. Pat, as we used to call him, came to me one day and said, "Hey, Roger, the films division requires new voices because Ramesh Thapar has moved to Delhi. Zul Velani is making a film. Sam Barkley Hill is traveling a lot. So I did my first audition today. Why don't you go and do yours?" So I rang up, and there it was. We had to speak the Indian newsreel commentaries, and we had to write them too. And so that, in a sense, was my first break into media.
Wow. And then take us to 1960, when you began your first job. Tell us how that job came about. What went into you joining J. Walter Thompson? Tell us about that.
Okay. I originally thought I'd be an actor because Al-Qazi, Ibrahim Al-Qazi, who was the founder of the National School of Drama, he was commissioned by Prithviraj Kapoor to do an acting course for Shashi Kapoor. And since Prithviraj was paying for the whole program, I was asked if I could pay just a token 10 rupees a month. And I could act opposite Shashi. And so I thought it'd be interesting. And, I thought I'd become an actor, with that. And Joy Mukherjee, whom you may remember from films, Love in Simla, I think was his first film. He was in class with me in St. Xavier's, and he used to tell me, "Roger, help me also get into it, etc., etc." But somehow my mind was more fixed on flying, and I was in the NCCA wing. And if you do 4 years with the NCCA wing and you pass the exams every year, you get 90 free hours of flying. And with my commentaries at Films Division, I was able to pay for the balance hours of flying. And so as a result, and I also took part in the Republic Day Parade. So all those qualifications put together gave me a direct entry to the Air Force. We didn't have to do the competitive exam, go straight for the interview to Dehradun, and then for the medicals. Now, I didn't know how my parents would react, so I didn't tell them I was going for the Air Force interview. I just told them I was going to Dehradun. They assumed I was going for another camp, a training camp, so they said, okay. And then I think the eve of my interview, they heard about it and sent me a message, a telegram. In those days, there were no mobiles or fax machines, so I got a telegram, returned home immediately. And my dream of becoming a fighter pilot were brought to naught. And I was frustrated. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have a plan B. So I studied law after graduation and studied for my master's in political science. Why political science? Because the great Gandhian, Dr. Usha Mehta, knew my family, and she advised my father that I should take up political science. And she was the head of the Department of Political Science of the Bombay University. So, but quite honestly, I was not interested in either law or being a student of political science. But I didn't know what I was going to do either. So someone suggested, why don't you try advertising? So I said, okay. And Alkazi, whose classes I used to attend, was the creative director of Shilpi Advertising. So he said, yeah, I will take you over and you come for the interview. Nissim Ezekiel was the general manager. Dineshwar Nadkarni was the copy chief. And sad to say, I failed it. You know? I tried several other agencies and I failed. I was no writer, so I can't blame them. It was my fault. I was not a writer. Then one day I met the recently elevated copy chief of J. Walter Thompson in December. I think it was 29th of December, 29th of November, 1960. We were both happened to be in a haircutting salon in Churchgate. And he asked me what I was doing, and I said, just getting frustrated. He said, why? So I told him, I said, I don't have qualifications to be in advertising. I'm not a writer, so I failed the test. So he says, do you want to be a copywriter? I said, I'd like to be. So he said, all right, why don't you come on Monday? So I went across on Monday, and what was very nice of him is that he created a special test, not to test my skills, my writing skills, but to test my creativity. And from then, I've never looked back. He offered me a job the next day, and there's, as they say, is history.
Wow. That's December 1st, 1960. And then take
That
us
was
from
December
there
1st,
in a quick journey to
Sorry?
1987. Sorry.
I was in advertising then. I was in J. Walter Thompson, and that's where I met the great, venerable J.R.D. Tata. He was the chairman of Air India, and I used to create ads for Air India. In the beginning, it was not a very comfortable one because he was flying, he was reenacting his flight from Karachi to Bombay, as it was called then, via Ahmedabad, after 30 years, the 30th anniversary. And the commemorative ad was going on back and forth, and it was rejected. And finally, apparently, Jay, as he used to prefer me calling him, approved one ad. But he wanted to see the person who created it. Now, J. Walter Thompson at that time was reluctant to admit that a trainee had written that ad. So everybody else said they wrote it, etc., etc. And Jay said, no, you couldn't have. So finally, very nervous, I went and met the mountain of a human being called J.R.D. Tata. And he asked me, he says, have you flown? And I assumed he meant, have I flown Air India? So I said, no, sir, I have not flown Air India. No. Have you flown in an aircraft? I said, yes, I have a private pilot's license. I've done 203 hours. He said, oh, no wonder. Only then would you be able to write like this. And that was the beginning of a fabulous, fabulous relationship that lasted right till he died.
Fascinating. So that was in the 60s when you began at JWT, J. Walter Thompson.
That's right.
And take us the next 25 years in the next few seconds. What happened between 1960 and 1987? How did you become an entrepreneur? How did you get into public relations? Tell us that journey, please.
All right. Well, in 1962, we were launched. J. Walter Thompson was given the task of launching Horlicks in India, Pakistan, East and West. That time, there was no Bangladesh. It was called East Pakistan. And Ceylon, as it was called then. There was no Sri Lanka. It was called Ceylon. So we worked day and night, worked our asses out, you know. A few of us, Noel Gordon, my copy chief, Damodar Warrior, myself, Shekhar, another colleague of mine, and Jadhav Kumar. We worked round the clock to produce this campaign, and we worked directly with Mr. Edward Fielden, or he used to be called Peter Fielden, who was the managing director, because this was a triumph for him. And we won the bid, we won the campaign, and unfortunately enough, those were tough days when India was undergoing an extreme shortage of foreign exchange. And the creative fee of 50,000 pounds, which was a lot of money in those years, I'm talking about 1963, was paid to J. Walter Thompson, London. And I was mad. I said, India needs the money. We worked for it. Why should the money should go to J. Walter Thompson, London? And I tried to argue with Fielden, and he said, no, Roger, you don't understand. You're too young, etc. What is there to understand? India needs the money. We worked for it. Why should it go to London? And so it should come here. And because then we would feel, really justified, etc. But I didn't win. I lost, and so I was very frustrated. By then, one of those days, I think it was February 13th, I think, yeah, of 1963. Mrs. Nuru Swaminathan, who was the sister of Justice Chagla, she was the account director on Air India. She threw a party in my honor because a campaign I created for Air India had won for J. Walter Thompson, the global account of Air India. Otherwise, till then, we were only handling the India account of Air India. And so there was this huge party being thrown. And I was in a very quiet, pensive mood, and I was sitting by the corner. And there was another gentleman sitting next to me in a khadi jacket and a khadi trouser. And I suddenly noticed that he and I were just the only two guys drinking Coca-Cola. The rest were boozing, although those were prohibition days those days. And then he asked me, he says, why aren't you with the rest of them? I didn't know who he was. So I said, no. He said, you don't seem very happy. This party's in your honor. Why aren't you in the middle there celebrating? I said, no, I'm quite frustrated, to be honest. I didn't know who he was. And I didn't know why I was opening my mouth, my big mouth, So he said, why, what happened? And I told him the story. He said, would you like to come to work for Shilpi? So I said, no, they've already rejected me. They will not be interested in me. I'll have to look out and figure out who I should go. No. He says, who did you meet? Then I told him. He says, he took out a piece of paper from his pocket, his khadi jacket. He was wearing a Western style jacket, but made of khadi. Wrote out a number and put out a name of P.H. Gidwani. He says, call him this gentleman on Monday morning. I don't know who he was. It turned out to be Vikram Sarabhai. And Vikram, as you know, owned Shilpi at that time, And the next thing I knew, I was in Shilpi.
Wow.
And I had a terrific career in Shilpi. We did some fabulous developmental advertising. In fact, we started a campaign of entrepreneurial development for Gujarat because, Sarabhais were headquartered in Gujarat. So I spend 3/4 of every week in Gujarat, Ahmedabad, Baroda, etc., etc., etc. Then one fine day, I met Mr. Manubhai Shah, who was Union Minister for Commerce. And he was going to Ahmedabad on the flight. And he was sitting next to me. And he asked me if I was in Visionish. So I said, no. He said, what are you doing? So I said, I'm in advertising. He said, what is advertising? Then I explained to him. He thought advertising was just putting up paintings on street corners, like billboards or hoardings, as we call them.
Right.
Then I explained to him. Then he asked me, you know, Bombay has been bifurcated into two states, Maharashtra and Gujarat. Most of the businesses in Bombay, which is now in Maharashtra, were set up by Gujaratis. But they are in Bombay, they are in Maharashtra, they're not in Gujarat. Do you think you can create an advertising campaign to attract them to Gujarat? I said, it should be possible. We can give it a thought. And then we launched the Invest in Gujarat campaign. And I worked on it from that day in 69 right up to the time I left Shilpi. And the campaign still runs, about investing. And Gujarat at that time was way down. And now I believe it's number 1 or number 2. And Maharashtra's fallen down. So now we're taking up how to invest in Maharashtra and invest in Mumbai. So it's becoming a full circle, really.
And until which year were you at Shilpi, and what happened then?
This
until
was
which year were you with Shilpi, and then what happened after that?
Well, it was a great time in Shilpi. During my tenure in Shilpi, I had wonderful opportunities. During the 65 war, the general manager of Lintes, Mr. Razmi Ahmed, recommended to Mrs. Gandhi that I should be part of a team that works. This was during the 65 war for the government of India. So a 3-man team was sent there to work on the war effort, because at that particular point in time, the perception was that we were losing the war. And so we prepared a campaign, Mr. Jeet Kantawala, Mr. Das Gupta, and myself. I was the copywriter. Das Gupta was the art director. Jeet Kantawala he was the head of Press Syndicate at that time. And Press Syndicate, incidentally, was the first PR agency also. And we presented it to Mrs. Gandhi, but she looked unmoved. And she said, I don't need advertising. Do you know any PR? So I said, no, ma'am, sorry, I don't know PR. Are you willing to learn? She asked me. So I said, yeah, why not? And so she asked Jeet and Das Gupta to go back to Bombay. She asked me, would I be willing to stay on? So I stayed on. And then Lal Bahadur Shastri died. She became prime minister. Then after we won the war, then came the food shortage. PL 480 happened. And she asked me to help out with the DAVP and Films Division to work out motivational campaigns to convince farmers to use hybrid seeds, hybrid rice, Taichung native from Taiwan, the Mexican hybrid for wheat, etc. So it was a great time. It was wonderful working with farmers and, in the rural areas. A great experience. In fact, I think I can proudly say I've had the opportunity of working with both the revolutions, the Green Revolution and the White Revolution, with Dr. Varghese Kurian. So to that extent, I've been very lucky. So what happened in 85? Why did I switch to PR, right?
Yes.
Okay.
No, were you in Shilpi till 85? Is that what you're saying?
I was in Shilpi till November 30th, 1985. I submitted my resignation on 1st January 1980, but I was not allowed to leave. And they kept postponing it. What was happening is the Sarabhai group, which was the number one group at one stage, started falling apart. And there were certain things that were happening that weren't to my liking. So I decided to leave. But I had to leave in such a way that the company would not suffer and that my colleagues would not suffer, because most of my colleagues had joined as trainees, so we were like one big family. So all those who were ready to get good jobs elsewhere, first let them exit. And then finally I said, now I have to leave. And so finally I left. But they made one condition. And this was the problem. Those were days of high taxation, lots of scarcity. So in order to save 250 rupees in taxes every month, I converted my flat on Mount Pleasant Road to a company flat. So they held that against me and said, look, if you want your flat back, you will have to sign an agreement that you will not continue in advertising. You will not take any clients from Shilpi. You will not take any staff from Shilpi. So I thought to myself, now what am I going to do? If I can't do advert, that was the only thing I knew. But of course, right through advertising, we did a lot of PR, as I mentioned to you. We did, at Mrs. Gandhi's request, I did in Singapore at Leak One News request. We did a lot of IPOs. We used to do a lot of PR for those IPOs in 74. So we never said this is advertising, this is PR. We, whichever would be more efficient, we use them. So, but at that point in time, I never thought of PR. But I really didn't know what to do. I just wanted to get out because I said it has already taken me 4 years, 11 months to get out. And then I'll figure out what I was going to do. And so on the 1st of December, 1985, I opened my eyes and said, now what am I going to do? Then I remembered various offers came that used to come from the World Bank and USAID to be a consultant. So I thought, hey, that's a good idea. Why don't I accept? I checked with them if they would be still interested. And then I was asked, yes, why don't you come? So I went. The first assignment was to Indonesia. And so we did an assignment over there. That was on nutrition and family planning. And came back. Very interesting. Met an old colleague called Bapu Devlalikar, and we were very good friends in Ahmedabad. And he and I teamed up, as always, very well. and the rest of the team was American. And as usual, two Indians team up, and we had a good time. I think we did a good job. But and this was followed one after the other. That was USAID, then came a World Bank assignment in Japan, another one in Washington, one in Yemen. But gradually I began to get very frustrated. And the good news was that in between, Mr. Tata would ring up home, and my wife would pick up the phone and say, I'd like to speak to Roger Pereira. And my wife didn't recognize the voice. And so she said, who's speaking? So he said, Mr. Tata here. Now, I had two friends in college, one named A.C. Tata, and the other was his brother, Ratan Tata, not the real Ratan Tata, it's another Ratan Tata, who was also in the NCC, but he was in artillery. So she thought it was one of them, So when I came back, I called back, and he said, would you like a cup of coffee? But I said, I'd love to. And then we started chatting. I have to say, in between, whilst I was in Shilpi, he introduced me and gave us a Centaur account. Centaur was the Hotel Corporation of India, which is a division of Air India. He gave me an introduction letter to the managing director, who happened to be another Pereira, and said that this gentleman who brings you this note, Roger Pereira, used to create some very good advertising for us through J. Walter Thompson. So it would be nice, other things being equal, etc. So we did a bid, we won the bid. So, we were in touch from time to time. And then he asked me, so how are you doing in this consultancy? So I said, I'm getting bored. He said, why? I said, look, we spend most of our time writing these voluminous reports and nobody reads them. So it's quite frustrating, and you don't know whether what you're recommending is going to be implemented today, tomorrow, or ever. So then he asked me, why don't you start an advertising agency? Then I explained to him the problem. So he walked me across the corridor to Mr. Nani Palkiwala, a giant of a legal luminary at that time, and told me to relate to Mr. Palkiwala what the issue was. So I explained it. And Mr. Palkiwala said, no, this comes stand in court. But then both Jay and I felt that this is not something we're going to go to court with. So let's stay with it. So then he said, why don't you think of PR? So I said, PR? Actually, a former colleague of mine, Sharad Sachdev, who actually succeeded me in Shilpi, did suggest it, but I never took it seriously. Jay was very, very enthusiastic about PR, and he called his PR chieftain called Shahrukh Sapawala. They had just run a campaign, just means a few years ago, for Tata Steel when George Fernandez's ministry wanted to nationalize it. And I don't know if you remember a campaign they ran. It was a PR campaign, but run in advertising. It was called We Also Make Steel. It was one of the most brilliant advertising campaigns. Actually, it was PR, And it talked about how Tata Steel does so much for the community, etc. In other words, how can you possibly nationalize a company that does more for the community than Hindustan Steel, your own public sector undertaking, So there was a groundswell of voices against nationalization of Tata Steel. So Jay said, look, if you can do PR like this, why don't you start? This was in April 25th, I think, 1987. And so I said, yeah, then I was wondering, but who come to me for PR? I'm not known to be a PR guy. So to start with, Mr. Tata gave us the Tata Sons account and a whole lot of Tata businesses. And, I couldn't have asked for more. And soon after that, Tata Sons was selling Tata Tomco, which is Tata Oil's and soap manufacturing company, Hammam soap, etc., to Hindustan Lever. So he asked us to handle that acquisition. Then he rang up Sushim Datta, who was the chairman of Levers, and said, who are you planning to hire for your side of the work? So I don't think Sushim had taken a decision. So he told Sushim, we're going to hire Roger, who's just started this PR firm. Why don't you also hire him? And so we can both work in tandem. And Sushim said, yes, sounds like a good idea. Don't really know Roger, but if you say so, let's do it. And I went and met him, etc. And that worked out very well. Then came the next corporate sale of Lakmate levers. That was given to us, both from their side as well as from the lever side. And there was no looking back.
Right. No, interesting. What did you call your firm when you launched it in 1987? Tell us about the name of the firm as well.
The firm at that time, originally, it was called Roger Pereira Consultants. Why? Because I got some tax concessions for professionals who become entrepreneurs. There was some tax advantage. My chartered accountant, a guy called Devarajan, advised me. He said, call it this way, and then you'll get this tax advantage. Which I said, fine. And then we wanted to change it to Roger Pereira Communications. As luck would have it, Person Mastella was handling the Union Carbide was doing the backlash of Union Carbide. So they had reached out to me. I didn't know Harold Burson at all. I knew Bill Mastella. Bill Mastella was headed what was called Mastella Advertising at that time.
Right.
And Mastella Advertising was doing what we used to call in those days industrial advertising. And Mr. N.T. Godrej, who was a great believer in machine tools manufactured in India, and he used to handle that machine tool exhibition every year. One day, Mr. Godrej took me aside and said, Roger, the one big problem we have participants from Japan, UK, all over Europe, Germany, but nothing from the US. Do you think you can help us get participation in the US? So I thought, and I thought of Bill Mastella. But how do I didn't even know Bill Mastella at that time, And as luck would have it, I was being asked to speak in Brussels at an advertising conference. And they told me who were the other guys who had agreed to speak. So I looked at it, and there I saw Bill Mastella. Wow, that's a coincidence. So I wrote back to the organizers. I said, if I can get a slot in that panel, I'd be happy to accept. And the rest, as they say, is history. Then Bill and I became very good friends. And so we continued to do, Shilpi continued to be a kind of an unofficial affiliate of Mastella Advertising. And Mastella merged with Harold Burson's firm. And then they got bought over by Young and Rubicam. So we started getting a lot of work from advertising work from Young and Rubicam, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 1986, there was a World Advertising Congress. And for the rest of the world, I was still in advertising. And I was one of the speakers there. The Congress was in Chicago. And Ed Ney, who was the chairman of Young and Rubicam, and was also the chairman of the IAA at that time, he and I hit it off, because we were speaking at the same session. And he invited me over for drinks and for dinner that night and said, I noticed from your CV, you said you're advertising, you were in advertising up to November 30th, 1985. What happened then? This was August of 1986. I said, I've been doing some consulting work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why don't you join up with us? But at that time, Young and Rubicam was already tied up with rediffusion. And, I'm an old-fashioned guy. I don't like to cut off friends, So I said, no, you're already linked up with my friend Arunanda. So let's look at it. He said, what else would you like? Would you like to think of PR? And I said, that's strange. This is what JRD was also talking about. So he rang up Harold. He said, when do you get to, this was in Chicago. And he says, when do you get to New York? So I told him, and he said, why don't you go and meet Harold? And so I met Harold, and then there was Bob Leaf, who was the chief international guy. Bob Leaf apparently had already made his affiliation in India almost final. They had only to get Ed Ney to sign on the dotted line. And Ed Ney said, no, I'm not signing that. You sign it with Roger. And he said, we've been doing business with Roger. Mastella Advertising been doing business with Roger for the last so many years, and they find them very ethical and etc. So why don't you join hands? So that's how the relationship with Person Master has happened through advertising. Yeah.
Interesting. And I know at some point of time you had to part ways with Burson Masala and then eventually become an affiliate of Edelman as well in India.
Oh
How
yeah,
did
yeah,
that
yeah. I tell
before I
you.
come to, yeah, how did that transition happen? You can tell us that story and feel free to talk and share as much as you want to, because this is going to be in the archives for the record, going to be there for people for years to come to listen to and understand how all these things evolved.
Sure, sure. So our relationship with Burson Marsteller was that of an affiliate, because at that time no foreign equity was permitted, no partnerships were permitted. Then came Manmohan Singh's wonderful liberalization program, and where they were going to encourage foreign participation, And I happened to be in Delhi, and I think Mr. Sundaram from the Gujarat cadre was in the Commerce Secretary at that time. So I rang up Mr. Sundaram and I said, "Is this for real? I mean, can we really have a partnership?" He said, "Yeah, Raj, of course." So I said, "Look, I am in Delhi, but I don't have letterheads and all. Can I submit an app?" He said, "Come, I'll give you paper. You write it, handwrite it in my office, and I'll give you approval right away." I said, "What?" And in fact, that's what they were doing, Amith. So immediately rang up New York. I said, "Look, I had given you my word that as soon as equity participation is permitted, I'd let you know. It is now being permitted. Would you be interested?" They said, "Yes, of course, Roger, we'd be interested." So I said, "Shall I apply for 50-50?" They said, "Fine." So, Sundaram said, "Look, you can also give them majority. That's also possible." But Burson Marsteller said, "No, 50-50 is fine. Let's stay with 50." Now, Young and, as I said, mentioned to you earlier, Burson Marsteller at that time was part of Young and Rubicam.
Right.
Young and Rubicam, as well as Burson Marsteller, was employee owned. It was not like most other advertising agencies. So because of my relationship with Ed Ney down the line, Tom Dowling, etc., etc., and an Indian named Satish Korde, very dear friend of mine till now, we decided to sell them equity at par. Okay, so they paid 10 rupees for a 10 rupee share. And the capital was just 7 lakhs rupees to start with. So there we go. In came Martin Sorrell, the great man. And he asked for a meeting with me when he had bought over Young and Rubicam. So when he bought over Young and Rubicam, Burson Marsteller also got bought over. And he said, "I believe we have a partnership." So he said, "Yes." I said, "Yes." He says, "I want to end it." So that took me apart. He says, "There is no partnership with Martin Sorrell. Martin Sorrell owns 100%. So he says, "Oh, you buy me out and you'll have to pay me some $4 million or something," is what he asked for an equity investment of 3.5 lakhs equivalent. Huh? So I said, "No way." He said, "No way, you take it or leave it, my friend. Otherwise, I buy you out." And I said, "No, I've started this and this is my company. And I'm not selling. And if anything, I'll buy you out." He said, "All right. I've told you my price." I said, "No, I will buy you out at the price I sold it to Burson Master and Young and Rubicam." And so we called lawyers. This was, I think, at the Taj Lands End. Yeah, there was some party of one of the WPP affiliates. So this went on back and forth, back and forth. "No, you won't. Yes, you can. No, you can't. Yes, you can. Yes, we can," etc., etc. And after 3 months, I think he realized it was getting nowhere. So he said, "Okay, I'll sell you our stake at par." So I bought back my stake at par. What we sold it at, we bought it back at.
Right. Interesting.
And that was the end of that relationship. It was unfortunate because Martin Sorrell was never in the equation at that time, And Harold was almost in tears because he and I had gone very close to each other, through the years. And he said, look, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do about it. I said, don't worry. Uh, Times change and we move on. And then I got a call from a guy called Alan Vandermolen, who used to work in Burson Marsteller, and he had become Asia Pacific head of Edelman. And I think they were affiliated with Genesis at that time. And he's asked me, he said, Roger, would you like to join hands with us? I said, look, I've just had this experience, so I've learned a lot. So I have to check with my lawyer friends. And it'll have to be not a friendship agreement, it'll have to be an arm's length transaction kind of thing. Yeah, whatever it is. And to cut a long story short, after about a year and a half, we decided to give them equity in our company. Then they made a request. Can we have 51% instead of 50%? So I said, why? They said, only because we can then consolidate our global earnings. And since we were not a global company, I said, doesn't make a difference. I checked with my lawyer friends, my board, Daraya Sudwadia, Ravi Kulkarni, etc. And they said, yeah, if it helps them, let's be magnanimous. And that's how the relationship happened with Edelman.
Wow. Fascinating. You know, I met you for the first time. I have heard of you from 2003 and 4 when I began my career in PR. And I had a couple of people who mentioned your name in my early days as a student of PR who worked in your company. But I only met you in 2019, in September 2019, I think, at the Hyderabad Praxis. And you won't believe, a month after that, I happened to be in New York City and I met Harold Burson. And he inquired about you. And I told him, I said, I've known Roger, but I met him for the first time only a month prior. So it was a very interesting 6 weeks for me to meet both you and him in quick succession. And sadly, a few months later, Harold Burson moved on, passed away. But I have fond memories of our first meetings, both with you and him. And I'm looking forward to meeting you.
He was a personal friend because he used to come over for dinner in New York to my daughter's place, you know.
Right.
And we spent wonderful evenings. In fact, I'm the guy who forced him to write his biography.
I see.
Yeah, because I said, you know, everybody else in Boston is writing their biographies. I remember it was in my daughter's house in Irvington. And my 7-year-old grandson decided to cook cookies for Harold.
I see.
He took them, you know.
Talking of biographies, I wish and hope you have the interest to write one in the next few years if you can.
Sorry. I didn't get you.
I said you're only 81, 82. I hope in the next 5-6 years you can write your biography as well and help people learn about your life beyond just this interview that we're doing.
I would love to. I've got so many requests. You know, only yesterday I wrote an obit piece on my dear friend Anil Dharkar, who's the founder of Mumbai Literature Live, you know. And again, he died in March this year, unfortunately. Wonderful writer, wonderful human being. And again, the team reminded me, when are you writing your biography? My problem is this, you know, I worked very closely with a whole galaxy of people. You know, you mentioned any global client and they were clients of ours, you know. And I've worked with Jack Welch, I've worked with Lee Kuan Yew, I've worked with Inder Gujral, I've worked with Dr. Varghese Kurian, I've worked with Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, I've worked with Vasant State, you know, all kinds of people. And, you know, and my meetings and my relationships with them, with each one of them has been no holds barred. So I carry a lot of secrets. And I'm scared that in my
biography, you can write a version which doesn't have all the secrets. You can write a slightly diluted version. It will still give a lot of insights.
This is what my worry is. So I've got to figure out how I can sift that, you know, and make sure. Because there are some secrets which were secrets then. For example, I had 2 secrets with Jay, which he vowed never to disclose. But I think one of them I disclosed in 2014 at the huge Rotary group that asked me, you know, to. They said, we heard that you were very close to Mr. Tata. Can you tell us what was it like? And I gave them these 2 stories. I said, look, I'm breaking my promise to him. And I looked up at him and I said, I hope you don't mind. Because they're fabulous stories. But that's for another day.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you the last couple of questions before we wind up, and I'd love to ask you more in the future. But I think for the sake of this ComSpeak, the last couple of questions. One
Yeah.
is take us to your. I mean, you told us about your college days. You told us about your father wanting you to do political science and the whole issue with becoming a fighter pilot. But tell us about your growing up days, the school you went to, which part of Mumbai you grew up in,
Oh, I
and
grew up,
just throw some light on
yeah.
that as well, please.
I'm part of a small community that the Bombay High Court describes as the original inhabitant of Bombay. So we go back some 400 years, not personally, of course, in the city of Mumbai. And I come from a village in Bandra called Ranwar. That's where I grew up. And you won't believe this, but I used to be called Shorty when I was young. I was short and fat and plump, but I was very bold. So in school, the big boys wanted to irritate a master or a teacher, they'd ask me to say something, and I'd go right up front there and say it, etc. But result was it gave me a lot of guts, a lot of courage. And Bandra was a very different place at that time. It was one big village, it didn't matter whether you were a Pathari Prabhu or a Khojar or a Shia or a Parsi or a Gujarati or whatever, or a Catholic or an East Indian or a Goan or a Mangalorean. We were all family. Mothers would ring up each other, as to which car would take all the children to Eros or to Metro for the Metro Cub show, etc., etc. It was one big family, and you couldn't walk in Bandra without saying good morning, uncle, good morning, auntie, etc., etc. It was a difference. So I went to a school called St. Stanislaus, and and then we had the zonals in Bandra, and that's where I won the inter-school elocution competition at the Bandra Gymkhana. And because we had the zonals and I took part and I won in the elocution, an auntie from whom I never knew said, "Why haven't you entered the inter-school elocution at the Bandra Gymkhana?" I said, "I didn't even know about it." She said, "Go tell your principal, we want you to enter." So I entered, and then, of course, I won it and won several others after that. And so that's where I grew up. I went to that school. Then I went to St. Xavier's College, made a whole lot of friends, joined the NCC Air Wing, as I mentioned to you. Had a wonderful time at the NCC, learned flying and enjoyed flying. Had an opportunity to doing aerobatics with my squadron leader, Air Force guys, and which was wonderful. One of them actually finished, took me once for aerobatics, squadron leader Lal Kaka, and then said, "Now would you like to go sailing?" Because he was a great sailor also. On the he used to sail a yacht. So he took me in his Jeep right up to the gateway of India, and then we straight from aerobatics in a tiger moth, we went into a sailboat, It was fantastic.
I mean, this interview has been fascinating for me. I mean, so many stories. There's so many stories you're sharing, and I think it's endless. I hope and wish you write a book that you intend to in some form in the future. I'm going to just ask you the closure to how you moved on from being actively involved in working to a kind of semi-retired life. I don't think you're retired because you still do a lot of things. So I think in 2009 or 10, it's finally when you exited your firm, which Edelman by then had taken over in India. If you want to share something on that last few weeks, months with being the Edelman India part and moving out, you can share.
I'll be upfront with you. As I've had, this has really been a no holds barred interview. So I only hope I don't get into trouble. I don't get you into trouble. The idea, the unwritten agreement with Edelman was that I would retire as soon as I reached 70. So in 2009, I was reaching 70, and I said, "Look, Alan was the AP chief," and he said he tried to convince me. I said no. Then he mentioned it to Richard Edelman. So Richard Edelman sent back an offer in writing saying, "Why don't you become global vice chairman of Edelman?" And so I said, "Look, I'm retiring because I want to do what I always wanted to do in my city of Mumbai. And I'm not retiring to become global vice chairman or global chairman. So this is the end on the 4th of November. When I complete 70, I retire, period." And so a lot of bargaining and went on back and forth. spend 1 month in New York, 1 month in Bombay, and 3 weeks in New York, 1 week in Bombay, 2 weeks in New York, 2 weeks in Bombay, 3 weeks in Bombay, 1 week in Bombay. I was firm. And I said, no, I want to do what I've always wanted to do. And that is to give back. Life and God have given me so much. And I decided that when I retire, I've got to give back. And that's what I'm doing now for the last 11 years.
Absolutely. I know.
I'm enjoying myself.
Right. No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Roger. As we say bye to you, typically with other guests, we do a rapid fire. I'm not going to do the rapid fire with you today. Maybe we'll do it in some other form in the future. I want you to share a final message for anybody in PR, but especially younger people entering the world of public relations. What's your message for them? And the message can be evergreen. It was a message maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and remains the same today. What's your message for young PR professionals getting into the world of public relations and making a career in it?
Can you give me a couple of minutes?
I can give you a couple of minutes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. My concern, and I'm passionate about it, is that one has to be truthful in advertising, truthful in PR. Now we see a lot of news about fake news today. Amith, believe you me, fake news happened even 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, except then it wasn't detected as fake news. Dr. Kurian suffered from it, suffered a lot, but came up trumps. Ratan Tata suffered a lot, but came up trumps. I can give you a whole list of companies. The important thing is, do not allow yourself to be bullied into a fake program, a fake campaign, but stick to telling the truth. And I was telling my ASCI, which is one of the organizations I founded in India, the Advertising Standards Council of India. You have to fight to tell the truth and keep advertising truthful. It would be ideal if every advertising or PR person in this country and across the world would take an oath to be truthful, just as doctors take an oath, the Hippocrates oath. Yes. Every advertising and PR person must take an oath to be truthful. If that would happen, you wouldn't get this fake news. You wouldn't get all this crap that has adulterated this whole media and proliferated it, Honesty, integrity are most important, with whatever you do, because you may win a short-term success, but in the long term, you'll be a failure. I guarantee you. Not you, I mean, whoever tries to use fake news,
Right. No, thank you so much for that message for younger people to be truthful and to ensure that everything one does is done on the bedrock of ethics and integrity. Absolutely an important message that is driven home by none other than you yourself, who I consider, in a way, the father of modern Indian public relations. Thank you so much, Roger, for making the time to do this with us. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you so much, Amith. You're a great interviewer.
It was worthwhile. I think you were hesitant in saying, oh, how can I add value? I don't think I'll do anything of any use to anybody. But I think this is going to be a really, really helpful interview and a kind of video textbook for young and not so young PR professionals in India and around the world for years to come. For those watching this ComSpeak episode, that was Roger C.B. Pereira, the iconic leader of the world of public relations, who chose to retire from active work 10 years ago, but still works on multiple projects in his home city of Mumbai. Thank you so much, Roger, and I hope to meet you in person over a cup of coffee or lunch in the days to come in Mumbai in person.
I'd love to.
Yeah. Thank you once again, and I loved it.
Thank you.